Can we reimagine the systems we live in? How can economics reflect our common humanity? And can we change it in time?
Welcome back to Real Time with Steve and Friends. This week we've got Denise Hearn. We're going to be talking about her new book, The Big Fix, How Companies Capture Markets and Harm Canadians. It's going to be a whole lot of fun. Be kind, stay safe, and enjoy the show.
Welcome back to another session of Real Time with Steve Keen and Friends. I want to start with a robust defense of monopolies, or more accurately, oligopolies. I know, probably not what you were expecting. We've got Denise Hearn backstage. She's probably sitting there going, oh yeah. Now, I've not really started looking, if you're not really started looking around for anything else to watch, hang in there. You'll see what I mean in a minute. Meanwhile, hit that subscribe button.
You're up on your own, I think. Hey, mate.
Hey, did we lock up?
It looks like Dave has been struck down by the gods of the left. The gods of the left are coming in and defending monopolies. He froze seconds after he said he was going to do it. So
okay.
let's wait till he comes back on shore again. Can we get Denise on as well while we wait for Dave to re-arrive, or not possible? Julia. Thank you.
Hi. I sent my anti-monopoly henchman to that was all I wanted to hear about that.
Well, you certainly got rid of him pretty rapidly. So yeah.
Just kidding.
Well, I'm going to do the same thing at some point. So maybe I'll get frozen out as well. But tell us the thesis.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks so much for having me back. It's great to be with you, Steve. So you had me on, a few months back, and we talked about my first book called The Myth of Capitalism, Monopolies and the Death of Competition, which was a FT Best book in 2018. And the thesis of that was really looking at market concentration issues in the US primarily, and how they affect citizens, consumers, workers. And I got a call from McGill University's public policy school about a year ago saying, hey, we really liked your first book, and there isn't a comparable one in Canada. Would you be interested in co-authoring one in Canada? And I co-authored it with a friend who is based there, who's also a competition policy expert. So it's just come out. I've come off of a month of book tour, and my flight was delayed by 7 hours yesterday, so I got home at 1 a.m. So please forgive me
no.
if I'm a little sleepy today.
Where's home?
We just moved to Burlington, Vermont, just south of Burlington, about a year ago, my husband and I.
Okay.
Yeah, but the thesis of this book is, now that I have been doing this sort of competition policy stuff for 6 years, it is focused on Canada, but we do, of course, talk about, many of the largest companies. We have a chapter on AI, and I think in many ways, the more you spend time with something, you realize the more complicated and complex the world truly is. And so in some ways, we wanted to raise questions that, is more competition always better? And we think, no. What do we want from competition policy? What do we want from competition? And one of the things that we also focused on was the notion of the rise of everything companies. So this idea that, companies have moved from wanting to compete within one industry or dominate one industry, and they've moved to collecting assets across industries. And that sort of complicates things for regulators who tend to think in market share. Okay, how much percentage do they have of this industry or that industry? Well, a company like Amazon, which is active in dozens of industries, how do you think about a company like that really is an ecosystem now of many different, both tangible and intangible assets?
Yeah.
So those are a few of the things that we kind of talk about in the book.
Yeah. I mean, that's the economic theory itself is so far behind the structure of actual markets these days, because their vision, the three classifications: perfect competition, imperfect competition or oligopoly, and then monopoly. And there's just, there's actually a wonderful statement from Veblen about how economics is a taxonomic science. So it's not an evolutionary science. Evolution talks about how things change from one form to another. Taxonomy says, here's the stuff owl, here's the stuff bat, and things like that. He says the crazy thing about the taxonomies of mainstream economics is that there are 0 cases of those taxonomies in the real world. So you cannot find an industry with a monopoly. You cannot find industry of perfect competition. You cannot find one with imperfect or oligopolistic. There's a mixture of all these structures in the real world. And that's one thing I've become, it's been like, Dave, glad to have you back. What happened? Did you cut your own cable or what?
Yeah, that's it. The UK has just been turned off, if you didn't know. I'm not sure.
I didn't like your.
It's still not working. It's still not working.
I didn't like your monopoly.
Maybe you better shut that window again.
You didn't like it. I don't know how far you got into my monopoly defense, because I stopped defending them, and that was where it was supposed to get fun. But never mind. So I'm not sure how far you got before I got tuned out.
We didn't. Yeah, me and my anti-monopoly henchmen didn't let you get too far down the road.
They shut you down immediately. So you better use your democratic right to come on and finish your introduction. So we'll let you go back to that for a moment.
Well, actually, I was thinking maybe if I started being soft on the monopolies, they'd let me keep talking. And that was my sneaky way in, but never mind. Let's not worry about it. I was essentially trying to understand at what point do we just say all monopolies bad, but some scale it's impossible to have the economies of scale we have without, of course, some centralization of resources and capital and power. So to build big stuff, right? So it's just a question of it's not easy to then go, right, let's turn it off. Because these things accumulate until we suddenly realize we've got a problem. And that's kind of what I was getting at. So,
those are the very challenging and complex questions that competition policy seeks to understand and try to answer, right? And I think certainly economies of scale are a thing. Network effects, of course, economies of scope as well. And and I was mentioning that we have an AI chapter. There's really only a handful of nation states and giant corporations that have the free cash flow to be able to invest billions and billions of dollars in this type of developing this technology. Now you can ask yourself, is that a good thing? Is that, and I think it's more sort of, okay, so what challenges does that pose? How do we think about that problem where you do have this incredibly, important and, potentially disruptive technology really sort of wielded by only a handful of actors? So then how do we think about the types of regulatory regimes or other types of checks that we would need to ensure that, it doesn't sort of just become either, a sort of totalitarian state, either on the nation state side or on the corporate side, or some combination of the two.
Well, I'll pinch a quote from your book, which I don't think is out yet. I might have missed that. You might have already introduced that, but
it is. It came out a month ago. Here it is.
Okay.
Oh, because I tried to order it, but it was on pre-order, so I couldn't. So good. Okay, so I can order it now. But maybe I just couldn't get it in the UK. I'm not sure. But you got a great quote that I fished out. It was from your website. But companies increasingly want to insert themselves into every aspect of our daily lives, enveloping us in their ecosystem. And as we go about our daily lives, everything we do becomes a cash-out opportunity, and we transfer a bit of our paycheck to a monopolist or oligopolist. Industries be gone. We are the asset. Love it. That's how it feels half the time, isn't it? There's really no escape from these things. And
well, yeah, I tell this story in the book of going. I used to live in London, and when I was working for a macroeconomic research firm there, and we were right across. I used to get off at Liverpool Street Station, and we were very close to Spitalfields Market, which, if people have been there, is this great market. It has all kinds of shops and restaurants, a lot of sort of independent sellers. They also have a big antiques market once a week. It's a really just diverse, wonderful place. And when I went back to visit a few years ago, I was shocked because there was this new store in Spitalfields Market, and it was an Amazon store, but it wasn't a grocery store, and it wasn't a retail store, and it wasn't a bookstore. It was a hair salon. And
Amazon hair?
Yes, it was Amazon salon. And I was like, why does Amazon want to cut my hair? Right. And it kind of got me onto this notion. And so I started looking at, and we have these great sort of charts in the book that show all of the different products and industries that Amazon is active in. But basically, when you go back to even the early days of Amazon, they wanted to make it a daily habit, what they called. And so anytime they reverse engineered a consumer's day, and they've tried to figure out, okay, at what points do consumers spend money? When you're watching TV, when you're listening to music, when you're securing your home, when you are ordering stuff online, and so groceries, et cetera, and they tried to insert themselves into every single transaction that you would spend, and they've successfully done that. And and this salon was really interesting because you could only get into it with your Amazon account. You could only book, so you couldn't just walk in, right? You had to they wanted to collect the data. They wanted to know that you were there, what kind of stuff you were getting. And they were undercutting all the other independent salons in the area by about 10 or 15 pounds on every service, right?
Pounds. So
yes.
What sort of cost are we talking here? This is like 60 pounds versus 45, or?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, for a haircut, or for women, you can get your hair blow dried and stuff like that. And so it's just it's a minor example, but I felt like it was so emblematic of how, when you do get companies that have now all this free cash flow, they can sort of, continue to expand their, their tentacles really into every fabric of your existence. And that's the point. I mean, that's exactly what they want to do. And that was the kind of flywheel that Bezos talked about. And, okay, so on the one hand, maybe it is efficient. Maybe there's some benefits to that. But then it's also, you also have to ask yourself, like, does Amazon need to be cutting my hair?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's actually one of the things, we had Yanis Varoufakis on, not on this show, but on my podcast, Debunking Economic Podcast, some time back. And Yanis was talking. Have you seen his book, Techno-Feudalism?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Now, I was a bit sort of skeptical about maybe the thesis being pushed a bit too far, but literally the same week that I read Yanis's book, and I haven't read yours, by the way, I've got to confess, Dave seems to be the one who's done the research here.
That's okay.
When I read Yanis's book, I got a note from Patreon telling me that they're going to have to increase the prices by 30% because Apple was insisting that all purchases go through its app store.
Oh,
Now,
yeah.
yeah. Now, I don't get anything. I mean, anybody who tries to read my stuff on an iPhone is struggling to begin with. I write sort of fairly detailed posts. You've got to read charts and sometimes heaven read an equation. What the fuck is Apple doing, inserting itself in there? And I thought, basically, this is the point that Giannis was making. It's the same as the feudal system, where if you wanted to go, from one city to another, you had to pass through so many feudal fiefs and pay a toll each time you did it. They didn't contribute anything to the actual process or the manufacturing or the sale, but they were docking the ticket as you went through. And here you've got bloody Apple taking 30%.
Yeah, I know most people don't know that, but any time, I mean, both Apple and Google, they have a duopoly on the App Store, right? And so any purchase you make in the App Store, not only downloading an app, but then any purchase within the app, they take 30%. And it's been the subject of, there's a coalition called the Coalition for App Fairness that are other app developers that have tried for years and years to advocate that they lower the commissions. And they were even sued by Epic Games, which is a big game developer, because what happened as well was, some of the apps said, okay, we're going to build our own proprietary in-app payment systems. And then Apple would kick them off the platform and kick them out of the App Store altogether. And that's the only place that you can download an app, right? So certainly, I mean, that's one example of this notion that increasingly you have these gatekeepers that control the fundamental infrastructure of commerce, make it they control your access to markets. So if you're an independent seller on your way to trying to get to consumers, you have to pass through the toll booth, right? And if we go back to Amazon for a second, most people also don't know that actually Amazon now makes it's the second sort of biggest revenue line for Amazon is fees from third-party sellers. And right. And that those fees have gone up and up and up over time. So they have to pay for advertising. And, if you're an independent seller, you have to pay for the privilege of being on Amazon, because now over 60% of all online searches start on Amazon for e-commerce. And you're now also competing with Amazon because they have so many of their own private label products, and they have Amazon Basics. And so you have to pay to advertise and hope that they will, put your product up there on the first page. You have to pay for fulfillment and shipping. And they even charge something called a referral fee, which is basically a junk fee that just says, oh, we're referring you to customers through our platform, so you have to pay for that, right? So these are the ways in which over time, you have no choice but to go through, as you said, and as Yanis says, these toll booths. And that's the best position for a monopolist or oligopolist to be in, because of course, then you can charge high tolls, and that's where you get your revenue from. So they get a huge percentage of revenue from that, much more so than AWS, which is what people think is the primary kind of moneymaker. I mean, I think when you look at profit margins and you account for expenses, AWS brings in like more net profit, but just on a revenue basis, the third-party seller fees are extremely high.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I'm going to be coming back and making a similar case to what Dave did about monopolies per se and concentration per se, because that's something which comes out of the natural process, evolutionary process of competition. But this sort of stuff really is feudal. And like, I'd be happy to see, this is Musk is against regulation, but being against regulation means that even with Twitter, 30% of what you get on Twitter and some elements goes to Apple.
Yeah, exactly.
Apple didn't write Twitter, neither did Musk, but he owns it. The fact I wouldn't mind paying like 30% to Twitter at some extent, but 30% to Apple, get out of here. And that's the sort of thing you need regulation to stop, because again, the vision that all the libertarians have, they're still living in a world as if the textbook described the real world. It describes nothing of the sort. So what you've got, so get us into more of the details of the book on that front. Yeah.
Sure. Well, let me make what I think is an important point that you're getting at, which is, no, I am not against companies growing and scaling and being successful. No,
Yeah.
nobody is. Okay. And there are, of course, natural monopolies in some instances, right? That do, whether it's aerospace, or utilities used to be the example where you have such high CapEx costs and so on and so forth that you need,
Yeah.
or semiconductors are another great example where it's so highly specialized, requires huge amount of investment. And so that's not what competition policy is against. We're not, big is not bad, but what it is, what it asks is, okay, how was that dominance acquired? Was it through offering the best services and products, or was it through abusing its marketplace position and making it horrible for everyone else? If you're, for workers, for consumers, or independent sellers. And once you establish your dominance, it tries to ensure that you're not, acting illegally, that you're not abusing that market position. And so that's really what competition policy is meant to do. I mean, is it successful is another question. But
is that the case though? Because I've had so much experience with neoclassical economists who basically think it all comes down to perfect competition good, monopoly and oligopoly bad. And they seem to have that's the textbook approach again. So they simply say, if an industry has a monopoly or has a few large firms, then that's bad. So you're saying, is competition policy slightly more intelligent than that?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, it's complex because a lot of the neoclassical thinking came to predominate antitrust policy and enforcement. And so one example is because we had what was called the consumer welfare standard, which really only sort of concerned itself with low consumer prices. The reason in some way, one of the reasons why the tech firms have gotten so large is that for a decade, the biggest tech firms did hundreds and hundreds of acquisitions, I think over 600. And how many of those were blocked by regulators?
0, I'm guessing.
Right. Yes, because they were offering free products, right? Facebook was free, Google was free. And so they said, well, this is enhancing consumer welfare. And in many ways it did. But it kind of lost sight of these other questions, these, political economy questions, which actually antitrust law in the US came in 1890 with the Sherman Act in 1914. This was the time of the big industrial giants, the Gilded Age, right? And it was explicitly answering political economy questions about what is the role of the corporation in society, how does it undermine democracy potentially, how is concentrated economic power a threat to liberty and freedom. I mean, these were, when you go back and you look at the debates and the rhetoric around the laws being passed, that was explicitly what it was meant to try to understand and to deal with. And so this kind of, the infusion of the neoclassical economist sort of perspective into antitrust in the 1980s was very intentional, and it was kind of an intellectual capture of the enforcement mechanism, such that it sort of made that law and policy, very kind of impotent. It didn't do very much for a number of decades, right? But recently, there's been this what's called the neo-Brandeisian movement, where they've tried to say actually these laws are really important, and the agencies should use the full remit of their statutory authority and of their tools to really go after where we see these abuses in the marketplace, and they are everywhere. So somebody mentioned Matt Stoller. So he was former colleague of mine and wrote the foreword to my book as well. So he's kind of he's a great writer on this as well, and he'd be a good person to have on.
Yeah, but you mentioned the history of the 19th century, because that was the period of the great robber barons, and like a lot of that, as was caught up with a whole spread of railways across when railways actually mattered in America, because you'd lay a railway down, and of course, having planned the railway, you knew where it was going. You would then send out people to buy the land along the edge of it, to drive away some of the local owners, so that when the railway came through and pushed up property values, it was your properties that rose in value rather than the people who lived there previously. And some of the stuff over wheat aggregation and so on, it really was quite obscenely illegal or mob type behavior. And that's what the laws were originally directed at, which was entirely appropriate. But I saw this happening like in the 1980s in Australia, the whole neoclassical thing coming in, and forget about all that stuff about illegal or illegal. We can just reduce it down to whether there's large firms or small firms, and that was so brain dead. I thought. So I'm glad to hear that's. Is it lawyers who are reversing that trend? Where's the pressure for a more intelligent approach to antitrust come from?
I mean, I think I would say these, I think competition policy is inherently complex because you're dealing with the entire marketplace, every industry imaginable, and there are contestations over what it's meant to do, right? And you have kind of oscillations between, sometimes it's very geopolitical, and countries say, well, we're going to foster national champions to compete globally, and we're sort of we're having a resurgence of that type of ideology now because as countries become more protectionist, and then you have some which say, well, we actually need to foster domestic competition because we don't want especially in industries that are not globally tradable, right? So there's no reason why vet practices and nursing homes need to get rolled up by private equity, and the quality of service erodes and the prices go up. So it's very, it's a complex area, but I would say that it's driven, yes, by some sort of enterprising lawyers and law students, journalists, advocates. I would say that over the last 4 years under the Biden administration, there's been a huge resurgence of interest in antitrust because the agencies got much more active, and Lena Khan, who runs the Federal Trade Commission, sort of became a superstar in her own right. And she wrote this paper called Amazon's Antitrust Paradox, which looked at essentially this notion that low consumer prices were not, the only thing that we should care about, and that in fact that might have been a way that they sort of preempted or curtailed further antitrust scrutiny by continuing to offer low prices. So anyway, I think there's been a whole movement around this, but it's I see someone saying industrial policy. I think the reason why competition is really interesting is because it does intersect all these other legal regimes. It intersects intellectual property, labor law, industrial policy, IP, if I said that already, I can't remember. So there's, these things are complex. Trade is also another area that is increasingly, sits here. So, yeah.
Yeah. How do the sort of tariffs that are being proposed impact big monopolies? I mean, would they be happy about it? Are they going to be, does it throw a spanner in the works for their plans? Or is it like business as usual for them? They just adjust?
I haven't had enough time to dig into this as much as I would like to.
Actually, Mike, you might be really helpful on this, and sorry to drop you right in it. Maybe you're not, I'm not sure. But from a systems point of view, what happens in you add tariffs to the mix with systems that have already got all the resources and, a centralization of power in a market. What do you think happens?
I think businesses lobby for what they'd like. Then the politicians decide. And the businesses say, cool, we now know the environment. Let's make some money in light of the new environment. They just adjust.
Yeah. The speed hump.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is an interesting development, actually, because the pressure for tariffs is coming not out of corporate issues, but out of the fact that America is being creamed in technological competition by China very largely. And the response is, the Chinese are better producing better electric cars than we are, more cheaply. Let's hold some of the demand for domestic producers. So it's something which is outside this arguments about aggregation of service providers like Amazon or retail outlets. It's something which really is a national policy failure, because the original idea of globalization was we'd all benefit, and for quite some time before China got involved, the benefits went to the American capitalists because they'd take advantage of cheap wages and having set up a textile factory in Indonesia in a free trade zone, and then when the wages rose too much, they'd move to another country. The Chinese stopped that very effectively, and what has happened, a huge technology transfer first of all, and then incredible development of technological capability in China, and now Chinese companies are outcompeting the Americans. And at this point, nationalism takes over. And I think Trump's going to do it on steroids compared to what would have happened with what was the name, Kamala Harris, if she continued on, if she won the election. But yeah, it's quite intriguing to me to see the breakdown of the anti-protectionist case that used to dominate the last 40 years. That seems to have gone out the window in the last 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think there will be, as with any of these policies, there will be winners and losers, of course, and it's not always clear to me exactly where those lines will be. And I think on the tariff side, it's also not clear. It sounds like they're sort of just carte blanche, like ubiquitous across the board. But I would be interested to know whether they end up doing sort of more sector specific or country specific, tariffs, and how that impacts the supply chains. And like you say, I think it only encourages these longer term macro trends of sort of like nearshoring, friendshoring, a reshoring manufacturing capacity in the US. But those things take decades to do. I mean, you can't just, apparently TSMC has built a semiconductor factory in Arizona that just recently was able to match the output of the Taiwan-based factories, which is pretty miraculous. But this stuff takes a long time to do.
Are they using ASML? Are they using ASML machinery, or have they made their own?
I'm not sure.
It must be most likely AMSL, because so far as I'm aware, AMSL is the only company that makes those extremely high frequency chip manufacturing machines. So they'd be using. They're still based on the Dutch technology, but that's probably the only case at the moment of a genuine monopolist anywhere on the planet. If you want to produce, very, I don't know, it's sub-micron or what level they're down to in terms of the width of the channels in a semiconductor, but there's only one company in the world that can make that, and that's AMSL in the Netherlands. So it's So there are elements where large. I mean that's a classic case of it's not economies of scale. It takes an incredible level of technology to be able to pull off that type of manufacturing, and it ends up being only a handful of potential providers of that. And ASML has wiped out everybody else. ASML, pardon me. Is it which one? ASML or AMSL? I always get it confused.
No, you got me too. I'm not sure, but so there's only a handful of monopolies that are going to be directly connected to defense, national defense, which is that is in that category, because Taiwan is tied up in that issue as well with microchips. But for most of the time, monopolies are there simply because they've either they've just succeeded, right, out of proportion to anything else. So I guess Denise, let
me contest that for a second. So
yeah, sure,
Amazon, for example, sorry to keep bringing it back to them, but
yeah,
they're a great example because they were unprofitable for 10 years, longer than 10 years. And Wall Street essentially subsidized them as they built out their market dominance. And the same thing happens in VC, right? Uber and Lyft and so on. And so it's an intentional strategy from capital markets to sort of foot the bill and lose, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars along the way to getting market dominance, such that then you can recoup your costs after the fact. And so it's not necessarily that, okay, these companies are just inherently more innovative, or there's some sort of magic dust that Bezos was born into or something like that, right? I mean, these I think there's many reasons why certain companies become successful, and I think that the capital markets component is a really important one in terms of who they pick to become a kind of industry leader.
And so, but you're saying that but who they're picking, just to unpack that, so who they're picking though is based on the fact that they're going to deliver what they want, which is I guess some of the factors are going to be, is this person, organization, etc., set of technologies going to be aggressive enough to get us this? Is their proposal going to be aggressive enough to get us a return and then some? Because they're taking a big risk still. So hundreds of millions that go into, which they said was reinvestment because they'd earn money, but they just reinvested all the time for 10 years or whatever in the case of Amazon. But the hope is that then they'll be in a position to be this great monopoly that then can do all the things that you've talked about, get under our skin so much that we almost can't avoid them. And most people will say, well, it's super convenient to use them.
It is, yeah.
So there's that. So that's what they're paying for. So I guess it's
for sure,
a question of like,
but I think it's just, so I wish I could show you these charts, but
Well,
Amazon
can actually. I think you can actually probably share. Yeah, if you go down and take a look in the middle of the icons down below our faces, you should see up arrow inside a computer screen. If you click on that or press H, you should be able to share. Give it a try.
Okay.
It doesn't work, we can give it another.
Okay. Share entire screen. Is that working?
Yeah. Let's see. We'll soon see in a moment. Yes. Okay. It is.
Okay. So let me bring up this. Okay. So here's just an example of some of the things that Amazon owns. Can you see this?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So here's just media and entertainment, right? MGM Studios, Twitch, which is a gaming platform, Amazon Studios, Amazon Publishing, Audible, IMDb, e-commerce. They've got, of course, Kindle, Zappos, all these different things. They've also gotten into healthcare, so they do direct-to-consumer prescription drugs, grocery, Whole Foods, Amazon Fresh, Amazon Go. They have home devices, so they've got Ring. And by the way, these were, not all of these were developed in-house, right? A lot of these were acquisitions. Okay, then we keep going. So then we've got their whole various technology stack. AWS is the best known, but they have a whole other set of sort of tech stack companies that they operate. Cloud computing, logistics, of course. So Amazon Air, Amazon Robotics, they were doing, they want to control everything from sort of manufacturing to complete distribution to your doorstep. And so for a while they were considering drone delivery. They also have, as I mentioned, a number of private label products. So they have Amazon Basics, which we all know, and which is transparent to consumers, but they also own now a number of different sort of labeled products that you never would know are actually owned by Amazon. And again, okay, maybe this benefits consumers, but there is an element of that kind of illusion of rivalry, right? Where it appears as though there's more competition in the market than there really is, because you go and you think, oh, there's the Amazon Basics product and there's the, I don't know, Pinzon product or something. And you don't know that it's actually all going to the same place. So that's just, that gives you a little sense of sort of how much of the ecosystem of various types of products and services they now.
Do you know much about the corporate structure behind that? Because if you have, say, 15 companies that are all supposed to be competitors in a particular market and they're all owned by Amazon, do you know anything about the corporate structure inside that? Do they let them function as if they're 15 separate companies, or is there some coordination? It's one thing because it's such a huge conglomerate. I mean, how many companies are in the, roughly speaking, would you know how many companies are in the overall Amazon ecosystem?
I don't know.
Hundreds?
I don't know. Yeah, probably hundreds. Yeah. And so some of them operate as subsidiaries, and then some of them would have actually potentially been moved on book. I don't exactly know how that works, but.
Yeah, it's an intriguing thing to me because that's the complexity of controlling something like that. It's easiest to imagine they simply buy the product and then you've bought one of your so-called competitors, and therefore people, as you say, think there's an illusion of competition, and people think they're buying from a non-Amazon company, and Amazon actually owns the company. That you could have a passive level of control like that, or you could have some attempt at coordination. And I'm really intrigued as to which one is the dominant pattern, the holding company, or actually trying to actively manage what is supposed to be a range of competitors, and how they make the decision to buy. This again, it's because this is, in some ways, it's the denial of the textbook model of competition, which is that you have all these little rival companies, all perfectly competitive, all producing exactly the same thing and all charging exactly the same price, none of which applies in the real world.
No, for sure.
But what they argue is, coordination bad, competition good, and that's the usual ideology of an economics textbook. But what you've got with companies like Amazon is internally they operate like a dictatorship. You have this top-down command, and if it was this is one of the little dilemmas of conventional economic theory. If it were true that competition is always and everywhere better than cooperation, wherever that's managed, whether it's socialist companies, governments, or large conglomerate companies. If that were true, then we'd all be working as self-employed people. There's no internal market, in other words, inside these corporations, and yet they dominate the market as we see it. So there's a huge extent to which economic theory is, 1.5 centuries behind where the capitalism has actually got to.
Totally. And I'm so glad you brought up competition and collaboration, because I have spent the last year trying to think about about this. And I actually did so I'm a resident senior fellow at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, which looks at how to align public and private finance with the Sustainable Development Goals. And what's really interesting was that this was in some cases politically motivated, but companies, because they have been getting pressure, sometimes from their institutional shareholder base and sometimes from the public, to sort of do more on sustainability and environment, they were arguing, well, in some cases, we need to coordinate. We need to collaborate with our competitors to do that. And one example is the fashion houses said, okay, we know that we put a lot of cheap crap through the system and it ends up in the landfill. And we have Temu and we have Shein and we have these, companies coming in that sell you a pair of flip-flops for 50 cents or whatever they do. And if we want to reduce our output, we're going to have a first mover disadvantage. As if we just as one company decide we're going to stop producing as much stuff, then all of our competitors are going to eat our lunch. And so they said, well, we need to actually get together as an industry, collectively decide to reduce our output, but as a result of that, we're going to have to raise our prices. And that's like a classic classic antitrust violation, right? Of reduction in output.
Cartel behavior.
That's a cartel. And so then it raised these interesting questions of like, okay, so when are reductions in competition actually beneficial, and should they be allowed by competition regulators if they have some sort of sustainability objective or green purpose? And then it gets tricky, because you're like, does H&M and Gap, do they actually care about the environment, or is this a great excuse for them to reduce output and raise prices, right? And so it raises these complex questions about, when is collaboration pro-social and anti-social? When is competition pro-social and anti-social? And I wrote a whole paper about this if anyone's interested. But it does raise these sort of, really interesting questions. When we're still in a market-based economy, how do you think about when competition goes wrong? And how do you think about when collaboration goes wrong? Because companies do collaborate all the time. They do joint R&D, they do joint procurement, they do information sharing, they do all kinds of things. And basically all of the competition regulators around the world have what are called competitor collaboration guidelines. And they tell companies, how you can collaborate. And basically they say, you can collaborate as much as you want, as long as you don't impact the main parameters of competition. So you're not talking about price, you're not doing market allocation, you're not bid rigging, you're not price fixing. Typically it's obviously more complicated than that, but that's like the basic thing is you can collaborate as long as you don't use it as a kind of a shield, for cartel behavior. So it's interesting, because I don't, collaboration isn't always good, and competition isn't always good either.
We need a new constitution of some sort for all monopolies, which just says, don't be a dick, because it's so it's getting ridiculous. So so much becomes, interpretation might be difficult, and legal interpretation may come into it. But yeah,
Mike, you better dive in here. Yes, Mike.
So I'm reminded of a poem, an economics poem that I learned many years ago.
There's an economics poem?
I love it.
I will just quote one portion of it that I have from memory here. It's a poem called The Incredible Bread Machine. And the middle part of it goes like this: you're gouging on your prices if you charge more than the rest, but it's unfair competition if you think you can charge less. There's just one thing I'd like to say to help avoid confusion. Don't try to charge the same amount. That would be collusion.
That's great. That's so great.
Yeah. So you're right. When is collaboration okay and not okay? When is competition okay, not okay, and what have you? What I'm hearing here is a need for a new type of microeconomics, one that's based on, let's say, institutional economics, where economists get out from behind their desks and go to companies and find out what the heck is going on, how they're structured in light of technology, changes in technology, and building models that reflect the new corporate structures. And so we can say, with some mathematical certainty, under these circumstances, bad things happen, and under these circumstances, good things happen. And that requires, once we have some of that figured out, to write some textbooks and start revising the, 19th century economics that we're still teaching.
Yeah. And that's one of the problems that we've got an economic theory which is completely orthogonal to the actual real structure of the market. So one of my favorite pieces of research in terms of competition policy is Robert Axtell's work on the power law distribution of firm sizes. You aware of that, Denise? I imagine you are, yeah? Robert Axtell's work?
Yes, it's been a while since I've looked at it, but yeah.
Yeah, I actually met Robert about a year ago. And strangely enough, he's putting out a new book on this stuff, and I think his work is fabulous about what you get out of any competitive process or any about any evolutionary process. You'll end up with a power law distribution. Okay?
Oh,
and
yes,
Mike can elaborate on this as well. And so what he said, when you take a look at the size of American corporations, you don't get this neat division of large monopolies and lots of small companies in different industries. In every industry, but especially when you work at the aggregate level, you get a power law distribution. There's a handful of small companies with a large share of the market and a huge number of small companies with a tiny share of the market. And there's a very strong argument from evolutionary perspective that the fact that distribution is necessary to encourage the evolution of products over time, because the small companies look at the big companies and think, I'd like to be you. The huge profit that's there to be made. So the innovation we see in capitalism comes out of that power law distribution as well. So that makes me not completely anti large size scale by any means. But then the question is, do the corporations, as you're finding and you're elaborating in your book, use that as a way of crushing competitors, not letting them in the first place, or siphoning off money from a whole range of different industries when they've got this sort of vampire squid effect that Amazon can have?
So I think, pushing my preceding comments a little bit further, I think what has to happen as well, other than a new microeconomics, and this is, again, where modeling can help us. I think that modeling can help us understand where to take measurements. Years ago, 40 years ago, when I studied industrial organization, the old Joe Bain stuff, it was concentration ratios. And I think that Denise kind of suggested that earlier in the program. And that might not be the best way of measuring goodness and badness of market structures and individual firm size and what have you. So, well, if not, then what is? And to help us think through that, I think modeling can say in a virtual environment, in a simulation environment, what ratios of this to that might be indicative of a problem or not, right? And then say, now, in light of that, can we go out and actually take these measurements and be able to say something intelligently about a particular industry or firm size or whatever?
I wouldn't mind getting back to there's the human element of all of us as caught up, like squished between the big cogs of these monopolies is one of the things that you seem to talk about really well, Denise. And I wondered if there's a way to get into that. Just some of the, before we get to talking about the actual fix or the solutions that you would recommend, just some of the worst problems of what happens when we don't look after this. Because although I will qualify, when I was doing a little bit of research before this, I was just hunting around for examples of this in nature, because complex systems, have similar patterns, you'd think. As a very good example, 30 million years ago, when grasses emerged, they actually started wiping out forests, monoculture grasses, but they were better adapted to grazing, among other things. So they thrived, but they didn't take over completely. All that happened was the forests were relegated to very wet areas, so we've got rainforests, high mountainous areas, so we've got boreal forests, and cold areas, we got the cold climate forests as well, where they thrived, and then the ecosystem just changed and adapted and became more complex, basically. So it's not automatic. So I'm not trying to say it's automatic that they're always bad, but I think it's important that that human beings are the ones that are caught up, I guess, in the process of doing this, and that's different to nature. So I just wanted to go back to, what do we do when we're confronted with some of these pretty nefarious sort of things? But the workers at Amazon is the obvious one, right? Why is it that monopolies then aim to cut their costs so much that people can't, afford to live so easily? And we're getting convenience, but we're forcing other people to work like that kind of thing. Is there a response that we've got to that? Or did you come up with any examples in your research that were pretty clearly illustrated that?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think the examples are sort of everywhere.
Yeah.
And maybe I'll just stay macro for a second, which is when you look at the aggregate impacts of lower workers' wages, because you don't have bargaining power anymore against these huge firms. There's only a handful of employers. Or you look at, we had talked about markups actually the last time, and I sent over some of that research. So you look at how prices are rising. Basically that is how, and I think you started with that quote, Dave, from the book, which is, that's a main way that inequality happens. That's the mechanism through which this wealth gets redistributed and retransferred, upwards. And it's not the only way, of course. We also chatted about monetary policy last time I was on, and other factors. But if you're not only kind of the kind of economic impacts, but okay, I'll tell you a crazy story about my book tour. Okay. Which is, my co-author and I were on our book tour, and we went out to a bar after one of our talks, and we looked at the menu, and the menu had this thing called focaccia on it. And it was like focaccia with cheese and vegetable toppings and pepperoni. And we were like, what is this thing? And so we asked the server, and she said, oh, it's pizza, but we can't call it pizza because a national pizza chain that we all know is our landlord. And they've placed a restrictive covenant saying that anyone that is within the building and within a certain radius, geographical radius, cannot sell pizza. Okay, so they had to call it focaccia. And I think so now if you're late night looking for pizza, their bar, their little independent restaurant, is not going to show up in your results because it's not on the menu, right? And that's the tiniest little microcosm of a story, but you can repeat that over and over and over again, and you start to realize how, and one point I wanted to make earlier that I didn't get to, which is, all markets have rules and norms, and those rules can be set democratically through our laws and regulations, or they can be set by de facto private regulators who set the terms in their favor, just like the Apple App Store, right? They are imposing their own set of laws and regulations onto the market, basically without any challenge. And so I think that's what you see. There's a real loss of wealth for the average person. There's also a real loss of and restriction on their freedoms. And at its best, our antitrust laws and our competition policy can break open markets. They can free markets. They can make them more free, more accessible, more equitable. That's the goal. Now it's really hard because it's really hard for consumers and workers to basically provide like near constant mini checks on corporate power. And one of the other like worst things when we were researching for our book that we found was Walmart is facing a lawsuit for actually inflating the cost of groceries when you do self-checkout. So they were overweighting the grocery items so that you paid more.
How are they doing that? Actually biasing the scales, or
biasing the scales.
You put down a 500 gram object and it would weigh it at 550.
Yeah, something like that.
That's,
and there's all kinds
that's
of
just law breaking. That must be illegal.
Of course, but there's all
Yeah.
kinds of tactics like that. There's shrinkflation, right, where
Yeah.
you get fewer and fewer chips in your bag. There's skimpflation, where you replace chocolate with palm oil, which is cheaper. You know, there's all kinds of tactics, and it's really basically, what we try to contest is just like consumers should not be the ones who have to police markets all the time, right? These are structural problems, and they should be handled structurally. So maybe that gets us, a little bit to the big fix. But
Denise, what would you say to people who say that? Because that's the argument I really want. I need better ammunition for when I get told, well, consumer choice. You can always choose not to say use Amazon, for example, or wherever.
But you
these monopolies
can't.
are so huge; they're everywhere, and I think that's the thing. I don't have a good answer for that, although I instinctively know that's bullshit.
Well, the whole point is to make it so you don't have another option, right? I mean, you can't switch away. And so I don't think that it is viable to say like, oh, you can just switch when you want. The entire point is to envelop you in the ecosystem such that you can't actually switch away, or that you're so dependent, right?
Like that map of all the companies that are owned. It's like, well, okay, I'll just go somewhere else. Oh, okay, right, that's them as well, or something like that, or another monopoly.
Yeah, exactly. And also just that, it shouldn't be. I think we've over-indexed on our power as consumers versus citizens, right? And we say, oh, what can I do as a consumer to solve this problem? When we really should think, what can I as a citizen do to solve this problem?
All right, we'd better do the chatters list because I neglected it because I disappeared and that threw me completely. So we need to do top chatters. And Mike, can I get you to do top chatters for us this week?
Of course. All righty, here we go. Tony Wilson, Lena Dell hates the clock. Romanium 14, Drigai, Ghost on the Half Shell, The Herald of Change, Douglas Dowell, JD, TR, Sean Up, they're covering up here by chat. Dawn, Dan Ratowski, Econ in One Lesson, Reimagining Plato, Web Freaks, MMT, MIT, Jan, Rick O'Brien, Larry Summers, Long Defiant, Paul Trainer, BSC, Algorithm, Gunno 1972, Thomas Darlington, Jay Mills, Michael D'Souza Cruz, Phil Waller, Satya Sarma, Nadia Yvette Chambers, Danger Zone, Mole Man, Ola Menchaishine, Billy G, Amber Grigo, Daft Lad, Steve Frith, Progressive Econ, Julius, Neil Weston, White and Sunny Out, Gregory Clifford, Roger Hill, Christopher Dobby, William Turner, Man Light, David Collins, Crimea Jewel, Patrick McGowan, oh boy, and Bruce Wilds. Thank you so much and welcome back.
Well nailed. Well nailed.
Patrick McGowan.
Slow and steady wins the race. Safe pair of hands. Most pronunciations almost correct. Denise, you're paying attention, are you? Because you'll be doing that at the end of the show.
You'll be up later. Yeah.
Last time you didn't. We let you off the hook. We're not
I know.
tonight.
I was hoping I would get a repeat.
No. That's top of my list of things that must happen this time around. So unless there was a train of thought that I stopped you on there, Denise, and you wanted to continue, is it time to start having a look at the main solutions that you identified or wanted to talk about, do you think?
Sure, yeah. And I'd love it to actually be a conversation because, despite the fact that I have worked on this area now for a number of years, from a systems perspective, I think that competition policy can only go so far, right? And that in many ways, particularly because I also work with institutional investors and I understand like capital markets to the degree that they can be understood, that there are structural incentives within our systems that make it very, very difficult. And I also think, your power law, your power law sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Analysis is well taken, and so so I don't know exactly how to solve these problems sort of writ large because they are huge. But what we titled our book "The Big Fix" for 3 reasons. So the first was that I think increasingly people have a felt sense that markets feel rigged or fixed, which then you can look at the political implications of that, as with the most recent election. They're not working, markets and the economy are not working for them anymore. Secondly, the kind of quote big fixes that are often put forward. So sometimes people say, well, just add a foreign competitor, or in Canada, we have a dairy supply management regime, and people say, oh, just get rid of that and unleash competition, and that's going to solve the problem. We need more competition. That's the solution. We think that doesn't necessarily work for many reasons. And then our big fix, if you will, is what we call a whole of government approach, which is that essentially every agency and every ministry in Canada has to think about this as part of their mandate and articulate what they want their policy area to do for the economy. And we saw under the Biden administration, there was a kind of historic executive order that laid out the Biden administration's approach to competition policy. And it created something called the Competition Council, where all of the heads of the different agencies had to come together, talk about how concentration was impacting their sector. And so that was something, and also kind of a federalist approach. So in Canada, the provinces are responsible for consumer protection and for regulating commerce. And so we wanted to see them kind of step up and do more as well on this area where there are appropriate intersections.
We should welcome Ty in the house.
Hi, Ty.
Yeah. Or is it Leonardo DiCaprio with the dark hair? I mean, this beard
make your late appearance, Ty.
Oh, yeah. So no, it's what do you call it? It's Movember now. So,
oh, God Almighty, that bloody stuff. Okay. You're young enough to do it without getting white all over your face. If I tried it, I look like Santa Claus. It's just 1 month too early.
It just gives me an excuse not to shave for like 5 days straight. So I was gonna do a handlebar, but Marie said no. So
I can understand that. Yeah,
I'm not allowed to do that.
Do one and get the mustache wax so it does one of these things.
Yeah, she said I can't do that either.
Oh God, sounds like you have regulation back at home, my friend.
There.
Yeah,
it's very sensible regulation. I'm glad it controls your worst impulses.
That's okay.
At least you're not trying to grow a French tickler.
Oh, please.
No comment.
They're the Fu Manchu.
Come on.
Is one of those
from the Matrix had a French tickler? That's probably the most famous one.
No, is that the soul patch underneath?
Yeah. Yeah.
I used to have, like in my 20s, I used to rock. It was popular back then.
Wow.
I used to always have a little square here, right? But I realized
we need photographic evidence.
Another time.
Being very critical here. Okay, sorry about that. Let's get that back on topic after your facial hair disturbed everything.
Exactly. Ty, you've been busting to come on, and I was wondering why you didn't come on earlier, I'll be honest, because from this something you wanted to get off your chest by the looks of it. Come on, let's hear it.
Oh no, I drank a lot last night. I watched the Mike Tyson fight.
At least you're on.
Oh, did you? Okay.
So I didn't feel like coming on right away.
Speaking of competition,
Saturday morning.
Yeah.
But I am listening. It's an interesting conundrum. Like every famous economic writer has written about, the rise of monopolies as capitalism kind of progresses forward. And there's good and bad parts too. Yep. So I'll play devil's advocate here. The way Steve and I have met is through monopolies. Like the way I've achieved, taking, mathematical modeling and making money out of it has been through monopolies, right? And
through Twitter, you mean? Or
Twitter, it could be YouTube, it could be any way we connect. Like a lot of the ways we interact now are thankfully because of monopolies, right? And allowing them to grow to a point where they have, market power and can set their own prices and control who enters the market and who doesn't enter the market, right? So we wouldn't have, easy Google accounts that you can log in with everything. So there's a positive part to it all that's hard to draw a line where we say, okay, now you've gotten so big that you owe the society some, leeway and allowing other competitors to enter that market and give some some competition, right, and some choice to the consumer. It's very hard. I've thought about it, like, who decides, is it a nominal value, is it some sort of unit value to a specific industry? How do you actually do that? And even if you do try to formulate policy, is it just adding more bureaucratic layers on top of an already bureaucratic system, especially in Canada? We're very bureaucratic up here. So it's a conundrum. I don't like the idea that Apple is going to be charging my Patreon subscribers 30% starting this month. I don't like that.
Yeah.
But on the flip side, they provide.
Why, Ty? It's interesting because that's the thing you've talked about, like the accessibility that's been created by Apple for other things. So yeah, why does that one jar you when you like the monopolies generally with the concentration of power?
So I have to nuance it. I don't like it because it takes money away from me, and so I'm a human being.
But it's the scale of money. I was
going to say,
I wouldn't be objecting to a 10% charge, I must say. 30%. Just
so it's the piss taking. So we're back to don't be a dick. We need a law.
Scale, yeah. And that comes across.
On the flip side of that, both Google and Apple have made it very easy for people to click on a button, and I'm taking monthly revenue from them, and they don't even know it. So that's my own internal battle on monopolies going on in my head is, well, on one side there's this visceral part where, oh, they're taking 30% of I write those blogs. Why are they taking that much away from me? Like, I put my heart and soul into that. But on the flip side, 20 years ago, there was no option for somebody to press a button and pay me monthly money. I wouldn't have been able to do that, right? I wouldn't have been able to have that platform.
But the other side is that Patreon offered that initially anyway. And now suddenly Apple's coming, so we're going to take 30% of that. Where Patreon actually established the crowdfunding model that you and I are both surviving through. So it is the tendency to a monopoly or large scale comes out of evolutionary processes of competition. If you didn't have you had no rapacious behavior whatsoever, you'd still get large companies, not monopolies necessarily, but large firms dominating an economy because they offer something new, they innovate, they've got a new form of technology, or electric cars versus petrol being one of the most obvious examples. But there's many cases there where somebody comes along with something new and takes over an industry, and you're all benefiting from it. And so that then gives you this evolutionary power law distribution of firm sizes. That's fine. The thing is when it then becomes the power for the company at the top to say, okay, we're going to impose, we're going to use our power against our potential competitors. Like the industry I know best on that front is computing, as I spent a fair bit of time in the computer trade. And when I began, IBM was the dominant company. And you had IBM in the bunch, Burroughs, Unisys, National Control Data, Honeywell, VM's Control, NCR cash registers, Control Data, and Honeywell. They were the five. And then nobody even heard of Hewlett Packard. But what's dominant now? The small companies came up and created that dominance. And the evolutionary process now means that your major companies are Microsoft and Apple, and the hardware side has almost disappeared in terms of relevance. So this evolutionary process means there'll always be a big company at the top, but it won't necessarily be the same company, and that's a large part of genuine evolutionary processes. But now we're getting to the stage that the feudal stuff, which is what Jana spoke about, and you're finding the same thing, Denise, in the structure of Canadian industry.
Yeah, it was more escapable, wasn't it, in the past with other iterations of monopolies, it seems. Can I just, I don't know how far I got in the opening preamble, but something that Ty said reminded me of the example of Napster. Did I get cut off at the beginning before this?
Yeah, you got knackered before you got Napstered.
Okay, so for every decentralizing punk like Napster, right? That decentralized the old monopolistic record labels and provided free music while ripping off the actual artists who made it in the first place. there's an Apple Music around the corner with a scaled up network effect and an economy of scale. And then that morphs back into new form of status quo with contours very similar to the old record labels of the past cycle. So we don't, I agree with Ty. We don't get to escape the centralization versus decentralization merry-go-round, but Denise has seemed to got a handle on the fact that there are within that cycle we can reduce the effects of the worst parts of the centralization, which seems to be the most toxic or dangerous or undemocratic.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of test this out on you because, I guess the way I would frame it is scale is not necessarily good or bad. I mean, I think there's many benefits from scale, but scaled extractivism, scaled surveillance, scaled abuse, essentially. And by the way, that scale can happen through nation states or through corporations. And oftentimes it's some combination of the two. And so with surveillance as an example, right, that's when the real dangers of scale become, I think, more salient. And you can see where now when you have the kind of total control. And I mean, if we go back to Twitter, I like Twitter. I've met some of my best friends on Twitter. I don't know if you ever had Katrine Marcel on, who I'd mentioned, but her and I met on Twitter. But now you have a situation where because of the network effects, which are inherent to a kind of social platform, and all the politicians are there, everyone's there, and then it's essentially become completely taken over by the richest man in the world, and he's turned it into his own political platform. You see where the dangers of scale and how they intersect with the political economy. And actually that was true, when you go back and you study Germany during World War II, that actually when you have concentrated industries, it becomes much easier for political despots to coordinate their efforts through concentrated channels, and I think we're seeing that with Elon Musk. And so it's not that scale is good or bad. It's just how is that scale then used, and how do we ensure that the people who have control or governance over those entities do not use them for their own political or economic gain to the detriment of the rest of the populace. And that's really, I think that's like the key question, right? And that's not just a competition question, that's a governance question, that's a political economy question. And so, I think those are the things that we need to be really cognizant of.
So the network effect is probably the major thing which has changed over the last 40 years, because the first obvious case of a network industry was the telephone, because the telephone on its own, you can talk to yourself without needing a telephone. So you didn't actually start having any benefit out of the telephone until other people had it. And then, of course, what you got was when you had national companies running it rather than a national system. The company with the broadest coverage got the best benefit from the network effect. But that's, compared to most of the products we buy, there's not a network effect for cars, for example. But what we do get now with things like YouTube and Twitter, I mean, there is an obvious network effect. It works as long as there's plenty of people on the same platform. But you don't want to have multiple bloody social media platforms. I get sick of the number of I'm trying to keep up with. And so once there's a dominant company, it can hold that position of dominance, regardless of whether it's giving good or bad service.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I do think Denise makes a good point about sort of the balance between the good things of large corporations that they bring to us, and then it gets out of hand and what have you. I also think in the conversation we should discuss the folks who work at these bigger companies, as Warren Buffett would say, companies that have a moat, something that gives them a competitive advantage. Hey, if I'm an investor, I mean, from everything Denise has said today, I'm throwing, as soon as I get off this live stream, I'm going to go call the broker up and invest more in Amazon.
You should.
And, or any of the Magnificent Seven, because that would be another good thing about these large companies. I'm an Amazon Prime member, for example, and I like that. And I watch, the TV shows and whatever. So you got to balance it, the good against the bad. But Another aspect of this is the folks who work there. Now, years ago, the guy who taught me labor economics, economist named Chuck Crapo, Steve will like this. We spent the first about 4 lectures or 3 lectures doing the neoclassical labor-leisure trade-off, constrained optimization stuff. And then he goes, all right, enough of that crap. Now we'll do the real stuff. And we spent the rest of the semester taking sort of an institutionalist approach to labor. And the model he liked was ability to pay, ability to make pay as a framework for thinking about wages and salaries, benefits, and what have you. So you need both. And if you have both the workers and the company are actually happy because you have a stable situation. So if you have a moat, if a network effects or whatever, and you have the ability to pay, you can, you have good profits. Then the workers need the ability to make the company pay. So they need some sort of power, usually collective bargaining, that sort of thing. And if you have both and you reach a negotiation, everybody's happy. The managers say, whoa, we got for 3 years, we got a stable situation, and the workers, get more than sort of a subsistence wage. So the decline in collective bargaining in the private sector over the last, 50 years, it's not doing so badly in the public sector, probably bears an investigation as to, why is that and what to do about that. Now folks that aren't
Can you put Regan Boychuk's comment up here, please, quickly? By the way, just another comment up there. Regan, that is not at all the case. I don't get any private founding support. I don't think anybody else here does as well. It's just that there aren't nuances in the system. Yes, large. I mean, one crazy thing about neoclassical economics is it demonized large corporations, and it demonized them on totally fallacious grounds by saying that monopolies will produce a lower quantity at a higher price. Now, when you live in the real world and you go and see what real world cost structures are like, you find the normal situation is the opposite. The monopoly produces a larger quantity at a lower price. And that's because the whole vision of firms facing rising marginal cost, which is ingrained into neoclassical thinking, is simply bullshit. When you take a look at actual firms, they have constant or falling per unit variable costs. They therefore also have falling average fixed cost per unit, and that gives an enormous cost advantage. So rather than producing a smaller quantity at a higher price, they tend to do the opposite, a higher quantity at a lower price, and that's why they're being monopolies in the first place. So it is. I'm not saying a sympathetic monopolies, but I'm saying they've been demonized for entirely the wrong reasons in mainstream thought, and we're now trying to clear that shit out. So when you come to it and say, well, if you do get benefits, and Ty was saying this earlier, we all were obviously, out of large corporations become large because they provide something and succeed on that basis. But then the trouble is they can use that as political power, both in global sense and political within their own industry, and crush potential competition, and then you get lock-in. So that's the issues. There ain't no. I tell you what, if anybody wants to privately fund me, I'll give you my telephone number later. I can do it with the cash.
I'm blown away. I didn't know
Monopolies. My number, I can put it in my email. You send me some money.
There you go. Okay, yeah.
Monopoly tycoons.
I didn't know you had a staff.
He doesn't.
Am I a staff member?
Quick word from our sponsor,
planksip.org. I'll send you your peppercorns in the mail, Mike.
Yeah, double my salary, please.
I want to plug for Planksip, guys. So just shout out for Daniel. As a philosophy and culture media outlet, Planksip helps emerging thought leaders with personal branding by co-creating organic content. Now, Business Film Booth is a sponsor of the show, but this is a labor of love. I don't honestly think you guys out there listening are necessarily my clients or prospects, but if you want to know, just out of curiosity, the sort of setup that I have here is some of the things that I offer. There's actually a free tutorial and kit guide to the stuff that I use. Happy to share that with anybody that wants it. Hit us up in the comments. And also, I happen in the UK, at least, I do personal training. So I actually go to teams in businesses and help them with presenting skills, with setting up the studio and all sorts of things. But then I have this other life which is on Substack, which is as a writer for Substack Beyond Survival. So that's my dual Batman-esque, I'd like to think I'm sort of Batman-esque lifestyle that I have. By day, videographer, by night, writer. So yeah, anywho, let's get back to it. I had a train of thought.
When you said personal training, I thought you were gonna.
Yeah, that's what I was like.
You were gonna make us do push-ups.
No, personal. Yeah, so training on media. I should be very clear. You won't find me very good as a personal trainer. I can hardly keep to my own schedule. Training on media, which helps people. You know, there's a lot of people in business that need to do this stuff, especially in sectors where they've got to build trust and familiarity. And most of the time, they're outsourcing it to all sorts of automated processes, automated content production, which is AI dominated. It's not saying that you shouldn't do that, but you need to have some content now that is personalized, because there's this slop of AI just kicking around too much in marketing. So I'm suggesting to especially companies that have high-end services or premium products, or just generally want to connect with their audience better, they need to get on camera. So I help them do that without feeling too awkward and making it nice and fun to do in the first place. Anyway, so that's enough of a plug from me. I wanted to get back to on monopolies. I don't. It feels like, Denise, it's really hard to get a handle on exactly what the solutions are because of this complexity. I guess as an individual listening to this, what's something that you would say to them to think about or to maybe to action? Is there anything that you found is useful to do as a habit without getting into the whole consumers alone can fix this sort of thing? What's a way maybe to frame how to think about monopolies so that they can be productive and how they question, what's going on?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I did just want to quickly say that I love Mike's point, and it's something we wrote about in the first book, my first book as well, which is you have to have those kind of countervailing power forces. And so for workers, it is collective bargaining and other forms of power aggregation. So absolutely think that is a massive part of the solution set. And so I think for consumers, I think that where you spend your money does matter. I always try to order from my local bookstore, as much as is possible. And I think there is, of course, a trade-off between sort of like the convenience of large firms, which, after a while start to get less and less convenient. I mean, I told you that I was delayed by 7 hours on United, and even though they controlled the entire terminal where I was leaving from Newark, they didn't have a customer service desk. You had to video Skype someone from your phone, right? I mean, so there also gets to a point where the organizations also become very bureaucratic and sort of there's so much cost cutting going on and profit margin expansion that they ultimately become less convenient over time. But I do think so. Spending your money where it matters, and then also insofar as you have interest, I think supporting stronger, antitrust enforcement, and sort of following that, I think is interesting for people potentially. What else? I should have a better answer to this.
Well, there's an argument for Sherry Wise was in the comments just earlier with a comment about why we're not talking about the money that goes into R&D that a lot of these companies have worked on. There's a famous one, of course, was Apple, was that a lot of the background technology that went into early Apple, of course, was government funded, was R&D, it was DARPA and all that sort of thing. So
exactly.
I guess there's as the little people, I guess, looking on this, we could argue, look, there's nothing that you've succeeded with without some government help along the way, that even if it's just having the laws and regulations that allow your market to exist,
of course,
as structure. So I wonder if there's an element
and
of
firms that. Firms wouldn't exist without the state, right? They get their license to operate from the government. Many monopolies have are given IP rights, which are of state-sponsored monopoly on certain types of intellectual property. I think someone's mentioning Mariana Mazzucato's work, who's fantastic. There's many different types of solutions. So what's interesting is if you get a successful antitrust case, right, then what's the remedy? So you can break up firms, which we've seen in the past, and some even with Microsoft in the early 2000s, some people think that because they were under greater antitrust scrutiny, it sort of curtailed them a bit, and that actually broke open markets, and it allowed a little startup called Google to get a foothold in search, right? And so you can do that. They've also, in the past, we've done things where it's called quarantining, where you basically say, okay, you are not allowed to operate in this adjacent industry. You actually, again, have to shrink the operations of sort of like just focus on this area of your business. So that happened with AT&T. And then the other thing you can do is mandate like sort of royalty-free or open source IP. And we've also seen that before, like mandatory licensing of IP. And so I think, it's interesting, again, because these are all sort of like market structure questions of how do you make sure that you can break open markets so that they do stay, that they do have the capacity to innovate. And in Canada, because we are very oligopolistic, our firms have very, very low R&D spending relative to other OECD countries. Like they traditionally underinvest quite heavily. I think, so we assume that large firms, will spend a lot on R&D or innovation spending, but actually that's not always the case. So, I don't know. I think there's a number of different ways to sort of get at this problem.
Mike.
I have a question for Denise. So
yes.
I know we've been kind of doing micro talk, but in light of the ability to manipulate price and raise price, perhaps not always, but often, firm market power, what impact do the Amazons, if you will, of the world have on inflation, like we've been recently undergoing? Sort of a macro.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, obviously, as Isabella Weber is the go-to person on sellers inflation, and she, I think successfully proved that during the most recent bout of inflation that it proved more sticky because firms with market power were able to take advantage of an emergency situation and expand their margins beyond their rising operational costs. And there's also been some research, I think, from one of the regional Federal Reserve banks in the US that also a number of years ago, sort of prior to COVID, also demonstrated that firms in concentrated industries passed on higher costs to consumers, 25% more than unconcentrated industries. So I do think that a lot of central banks now talk about this and recognize that actually, in many ways, it makes their monetary policy sometimes less effective or slower. If they want to lower inflation, that concentrated industries can make that a more challenging prospect for them. And so I think that there's of course it's hotly debated, it's contested, but I think that the evidence is starting to come in, more strongly to say that this certainly is a component of that.
So Steve, you can help me with this, but didn't Abba Lerner and Dave Colander have a map or a market-based anti-inflationary policy idea where you had to pay to raise your prices above a certain level? Kind of like carbon trading or something like that.
I'm not aware of that. Abba Lerner and David Colander. Tell me more. I'm not aware of that one.
Yeah, I think they called it a MAP, market anti-inflation policy, and there was a pricing structure. If you wanted to raise your prices through your margins to a certain level, you had to pay for like a permit to do that, in an effort to keep inflation under control from coming from markup.
Okay.
But I don't have it in front of me. I'm going from memory here, but I think that stuff like that's clever, right? In terms of looking at, that's a more macro thing, macro policy thing.
Steve, you and Phil Dobby did an episode on Professor Feige's transaction tax, which I've been in favor of for a long time, but in the sense that it was you'd have to remove other taxes because but it's aimed at transactional, not just gouging, but across the economy, a way to manage large movements of cash, which is, of course, what happens with monopolies. And that could also be an anti-inflationary measure. So, but you did a whole episode on that.
Actually, one thing which is important, though, like we've skirted around this, and that's getting a realistic microeconomics to support what is the actual situation of competition, because neoclassical is just complete garbage. I mean, that upward sloping supply curve and downward sloping demand curve and marginal revenue, this and all this garbage is just a complete fantasy world. So we need, if we're going to get realistic economic policy on what to do with monopolies, we need a realistic picture of what firms are like in the first place. And that's I've actually found the same book, Mike. I've got to take a look at it later. So that's what I've been working on. So I don't know, is it the right time to show a mathematical chart or just talk about it? But the basic idea, if we change the theory of competition, we get something that's least consistent with what actually is the actual cost structure of firms, and therefore and the feasible ways in which they can then compete, and then also how you can have nefarious behavior by large corporations preventing that evolutionary process, which is the major case you can make in favor of capitalism. So shall I bring up, can I share a screen? You think it's a good idea or not?
It's the time, go for it.
Okay,
always entertaining.
This is what I've just done this fairly recently. And I'll just actually, this is a presentation of my lecture course. But what you have, your firms can work out when they've got a new product, you can work out the average variable cost fairly, you know that. And if when you get to the production stage, you're going to have that cost or lower. So that's your basic cost level. Then you work out a markup you can put on top, and the markup depends upon competitive pressures and what's normal in an industry. So markups are very high in fashion and much lower in computers and stuff like that. That's where you set your price. So that's your basic. Every sale makes a profit because the actual change in profit is price minus variable cost. Then you have a target output level you wish to produce to, and if you can produce a factory that'll do that, you get an average variable cost that comes out of it. And so long as the cost point where average total cost equals price is below your target level, you go ahead. And that's your break-even profit level, and then your plant capacity might be out here somewhere. And if you manage to get your target level, that's the level of profit you get. And if you can increase your sales, you get higher volume and a higher margin on each of those products. So that's the pressure to evolve and grow larger. And that's the sort of thing I think we need to get into people's brain nonsense of theory, where effectively the theory itself says size self-regulates. Okay? That's a major argument out of the neoclassical textbook. And then if you don't get small firms, then it must be some nefarious behavior by the large corporation. Bullshit. The process itself evolves towards large corporations. The evolutionary process needs the small firms as well. So we need that realistic intellectual foundation before we're going to get sensible policies in the first place to stop what is the bad side about that large-scale corporations developing, which is the capacity to use that large scale to exploit, to block competitors coming through in some cases, or to exploit the customers, which is what we're seeing, with the 30% tariff on Apple that we can't avoid because there ain't no other way to get the product.
Should we talk about something other than monopolies for a minute?
Yeah, go for it.
What have you got in mind?
I don't know. I'm curious what everyone's reading. I just I just picked up this book, which I haven't started at all, but this woman talks about the physics of life's emergence, which I'm very excited about. And I'm curious. Yeah, I'm curious what everyone else is reading.
I'm reading a book called Nexus by Yuval Noah Harari. I mentioned it, I think, last week.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm finding it really, really good. Actually, better than his previous books, which I enjoyed. But it's just a look at what information actually is, and in short, why we have a naive version of information at the moment, epitomized by the likes of Musk, in which you just chuck all this information into a space and just truth emerges from it. Which is completely crazy. All that happens is people use that information to further their agendas based on the existing power dynamics. You can't just do that. So we need to get to grips with how information travels and actually have a much more intentional approach to it. Basically, democratize it. So it's really good. A lot less complex than I'm making it sound, and it's well worth reading. So a very accessible book, actually.
I wish I had time to read for pleasure. I'm afraid I'm too busy writing and building Gravel and things like that to actually get back and read for pleasure, which is the one thing I read for pleasure, I've got to say. It happens at international flights, and almost without fail, I grab my Kindle and read Douglas Adams's Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That's my, if there's such a thing as comfort food, then that's my comfort reading.
That's great.
Then what's the roughage in the diet then, if you ever manage to do it? Because if it's not for pleasure, it'd just be economics, wouldn't it?
Oh, well, I mean, I like reading computer science, mathematics books and stuff that nature as well. Fascinated by what's happening in physics and seeing physics as reaching what appears to be a large dead end, watching what's happening with astronomy with the James Webb Telescope. There's an enormous amount. I mean, yeah, economics is pretty boring in that sense. And Ty, you actually made that comment yourself some time back, didn't you? You're into complex systems and you're forced to do economics because it's such a dominant thing.
So, actually, complex systems makes economics interesting because it's a way for me to actually simulate what's going on. I was going to talk about how I'm reading The Wealth of the Nations by Adam Smith because I never read it, so I'm finally sitting down, and it's
Are you?
It's so dated and it's boring as fuck. I'm not gonna lie. Like it's absolutely meaningless in our
What about you should do Theory of Moral Sentiments? That one's more interesting.
And that's one thing I haven't read myself, I must say. That's one of there's a couple of holes in my reading.
Why is that book so thick? Because my version is super thin and the words are really, really small.
They wrote it for Canadians.
I also did this IQ test. I did this IQ test last night while I was drinking. I scored an 88 last night on an IQ test. So I'm realizing I'm a lot stupider than I thought. I thought I was smart at one point, but it's quite clear to me I'm stupid. But I was thinking about we brought up Isabella Weber and markups. And so I've had the opportunity over the last 3 months to talk to a lot of insiders from some big firms. And one of the reasons there was persistent markups, and still to this day, there's persistent markups going on. Mm-hmm. But one of the factors for that wasn't just, big greedy firms. If we aggregate them all together and there's this big, large brain of big firms saying, we're just going to stick it to the consumer. What a lot of it was is we shut down our economy and we brought it back online. And the act of bringing it back online brought a lot of costs for big firms, medium firms, and small firms. Those are the markups that have really got factored in, are still happening to this day, right? So I like Isabella's work on the data side of things. I'm worried about the narrative because there's no different. If you go back to like Marx, there's always the interplay between wages and profits, right? And they both serve a purpose in the business cycle. And we oscillate around that business cycle. So there will always be periods where firms are marking up. So in my national model, one of the functions we did endogenously, and this is pretty empirical, is when profits are high, firms will mark up at a higher rate, right? So that's part of it. I can't read capital. Like again, it's too dated for me. The only part the only thing I got out of capital is from Steve, and that's learning about Goodwin and the growth cycle model. Beyond that, I just can't read that shit. Even John Maynard Keynes, The General Theory, I've read that 5 times. Yeah,
more difficult. Marx and Adam Smith are fairly straightforward. Keynes is a little more tricky.
It's a tough read, The General Theory, although it's chapter 18 or 17 for me.
17 and 12.
17. And I like chapter 22 or 23, and it's about trade theory, and it's a little dated now because it was looking at it from a gold standard age. I like that. I liked all the inducement to investment kind of part. It was interesting, though I think it's kind of fraudulent. The consumption stuff, it's just a derivative to me. You make money and you spend it. There's not much there for me. But yeah, no, economic books are really fucking boring, to be honest, right? I'd rather I like reading like physics papers and engineer papers like the other night because my hot water tank blew up 2 weeks ago. So what is Ty doing at 3 o'clock in the morning? Building a system dynamic model of a hot water tank. Okay,
IQ of 88. Do that test again. Come on.
Yeah, exactly.
But you at least 95.
At least 95. I don't know. It's the beer. The beer might have lowered a couple points there. So maybe I'm at a clean 92.
Yeah. Okay.
I agree, though. I can't wait to move on from monopolies. To be honest.
That's good to hear.
It's depressing too. What's depressing as hell.
So what's the next topic for you then? Anything on mind?
I mean, yeah. Well, I actually am more of a generalist, I would say, and I do consider myself kind of a systems thinker. So I gave a talk at a San Francisco foundation called the Long Now Foundation last year, and they try to get people to think in 10,000 year increments, essentially. And so long-term systems thinking, they're kind of whole earth systems theory, Stewart Brand, that's the kind of origin. And I'd like to do more work with them and interview interesting authors. Like I have a sort of micro obsession with biology and theories of life, which is why I want to read this book, because I read this great book by Carl Zimmer a few years ago, and what I found fascinating was that there's no universal definition for life, and that scientists have tried for decades to actually create one, and there's a NASA definition, but there's always some sort of real life biological creature or compound that confounds their definition. And
or you get things like a wildfire, which actually fits all the definitions, but it can't be said to be alive. So it's
exactly.
That's what we should be spending our time doing. In fact, I remember having a great interview with an Asian TV station at one stage, and they asked me what should we be talking about, and I said it's really the meaning of life questions and art and things like that we should be spending our time discussing. It's a sign of how dysfunctional our society is that we spend all this time talking about how does it actually function, because in a sense we don't know because of the sheer amount of ideology that gets thrown into economics rather than the sort of analysis we'd like to see it being characterized by. And this should not be what we spend our time doing. This should be moderately automatic, and it should be the creative stuff, the 10,000 year horizon. In which direction does humanity develop? 42, as no one just said a moment ago. That should be what we're trying to do with our time, not talk bloody economics. It should be obvious.
100% agree.
I'll do one more book. Can I do another book?
Before you do,
oh, yeah.
Just go to your settings down there and bring up the video settings, and you'll see you've got an option there, mirror camera. Whatever you're on at the moment, change that the other way around, because your text is coming out backwards. So just go to the settings thing down the bottom below our faces. The gear, see the gear there?
Mm-hmm.
Click on the gear. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, now show your book and let's see what you get.
She is now.
Oh, you want me to unmirror it, you mean?
Yeah, unmirror it. Yeah, unmirror. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Let's see.
Now let's see what you get.
But now I've disappeared, right?
Or just read it out.
Thanks very much, Ghost. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I've totally disappeared.
Bring your video back. You must turn your video off. There's a video. You saw what I did just then. That's clicking on the video camera. You press the letter S.
No, I'm turning it on and off. It's just, it's not.
Press V.
Coming back on.
Press the letter V.
V.
If you're just tuning in, welcome to Tech Support with Steve Keen and Friends.
Thanks very much.
Okay, wait. I'm going to log back in.
Give it up, Denise. Okay.
Yeah, come back to us, Denise. Come back.
Yeah. No, she'll log back in. We'll get it.
We'll get it just to read it out.
That's the first thing tech support tells you to do. Unplug it, wait 30 seconds, and
plug
it back.
She's back. Hold on. Bring her on, Julia. Bring her on.
What's going on?
Oh, you're still. Yeah, you're.
Do you need to turn the lights on? It's a bit. You need at least the key light. That's
when you went in the control panel, did you actually click in the video section and change your video input?
No, I didn't. Okay, but we'll try this.
Okay.
Okay.
I tell you what, you're back. We can see you again. Okay. Show the book now. Let's see what we get.
Okay.
Yes, it works.
Hey.
There we go.
Technical with Steve function.
Yeah.
Jane McGonigal, Imagine How to See the Future. Show us a bit. I'm going to read the subtitle there again. Just show it again. That's right. Yeah.
Okay. How to see the future coming and feel ready for anything, even things that seem impossible today. So she's a futurist. She's worked for the Institute for the Future in San Francisco for a number of years. But she has done these large scale simulations. So 10 years before the COVID pandemic, she got thousands of people to participate in a simulation where they tried to kind of get into a future thinking state, and how would they respond, what would they do. And actually those people who had gone through her simulation were much more resilient when COVID actually came and there were lockdowns. They were very prescient about some of the parameters that they had put into the simulation, government lockdowns, social distancing and stuff like that. So anyway, I'm finding it really interesting because she talks about the kind of brain science of trying to develop the ability to think into the future. And she says 10 years is that sort of sweet spot when you need to, it stretches your thinking and your imagination in ways that we don't normally do. And so being able to sort of envision new futures 10 years out is one of the kind of core components that we need to develop for better resilience, but also so that we can start creating that future, as we go about our day to day now. So that's a good one. I just started it.
There's, I can't remember what the research was, but there's some research or study done to analyze our relationships with our future self, and it turns out that we have a terrible. We can't have a relationship with our future self, and that's why we're often terrible at planning, because most personality types just can't see themselves, put themselves into that future state and go, here I am in this future. They'd rather deal with people that they actually know in the present. So it's really good exercise to do if people can do it. There's a personality profile I'm very fond of called 5 Voices, which has there's different percentages of the population all relate to and self-select in these personality types. And only 2 of them are future focused. They make up 7% of the population of creatives, which I think you are, Denise. I'm tend to be in that category, and another 9%, which are pioneer type personalities. They're also what traditionally are called like alpha type personalities, very future focused and driven. But creatives are quite able to, in fact, they're obsessed with the future. They can't tend to get their heads out of it, which is definitely in my case what tends to happen. But yeah, if we can get more people thinking about themselves and putting themselves into future situations, it would be really good, because it's a quality that's we don't really have enough of, I don't think, and people like me aren't good at explaining the future as we should be.
I think technology usually leads the way, followed by business, and then the governance and regulatory stuff the law is always playing catch up. And if we look we're a little more forward thinking, we might be able to anticipate some of this stuff.
Well, absolutely. Guardian type personalities, which tend to be the people who make the laws, and engineering type personalities, very present focused, and are deeply suspicious of people touting things in the future, because they're like, no, how does it work? How do we protect people? All those sorts of things, which are very important. But they also tend to not take them seriously. How to get those 2 personality types to talk more is a real challenge, actually. So Ty, you were going to say something.
I was just going to actually kind of mention what you said. What if you believe the universe is deterministic? What's the point of thinking about the future, right? It's the experience now, right? So I don't know. Like I
sounds
just
like a Dan question.
Yeah, I know. If Dan was here, he'd be able to answer that. But that's I've always
no free will, just pure deterministic.
Yeah, so I've always struggled with thinking too far in the past, all my regrets and stuff, and then projecting in the future. So as I've grown a little bit older, not as old as Steve or Mike, but a little bit older, Sorry, guys.
Isn't that at odds with sort of a quantum understanding of reality?
It's odd with complex systems as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's complex systems. Right?
One of the things that I struggle with all the way through my career is that you have this. If you look at how history is written the big man idea. Churchill does this and Hitler does that and so on, and you leave out the entire mass of the population in the process, and that is an insult to a large part of the population. But at the same time, you have this weird possibility that single individuals can make an enormous change to the nature of society. So Einstein comes along, and we have, the nuclear world evolves out of his, 5 pages of scribbling on a notepad in a patent attorney's office. And so you get this. How do you reconcile the large massive movements of people over time with individuals having enormous impact? And you can actually reconcile it to some extent from the point of view of complex systems and sensitive dependence upon initial conditions. Given that one person can have an enormous impact on how the system behaves overall, even though you say it's largely a mass-determined system. So I think complex systems and chaos theory and quantum, et cetera, give us a way out of that dilemma about is the universe deterministic or not. Yes, it is, and therefore individuals can have an impact. Mm-hmm. Determinism and chaos theory gives you sensitive dependence upon initial conditions.
I like the paradox.
Yeah. The Blade Runner original movie sort of tried to deal with that theme, and even if it is totally determined and everything's fate, then live your life as if it's not anyway. Was the sort of that's what I got out of it. Maybe I read into it too much.
Okay, so I just came on the show today for 2 reasons. One, to show my support for Denise and her new book, and 2, for her to read the top chatters list. So that's kind of where I'm at right now.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Okay, here we go.
Okay.
Here we go.
Fast
All
as
right.
I like.
Okay, Tony Wilson, Lana Del Hates the Clock, Romanium 14, Drag-Eye, Ghost on the Half Shelf, who I saw was reading Left Hand of Darkness, which I appreciate. The Herald of Change, Douglas Dowell, JD, TR, Sean Demaratowski, Economics in One Lesson, Reimagining Plato, Web Freaks, MMT, Mitt Yan, Rick O'Brien, Larry Summers, our favorite, Long Defiant, Paul Trainer BSc, Algorithm, Gunny 1972, Thomas Darlington, Jay Mills, Michael D'Souza Cruz, Phil Waller, Satya Sarma, Nadia Yvette Chambers, Danger Zone, also another great one, Mole Man, Ole Mensch, I'm sorry, I can't even attempt that one, Billy G, Amber Grego, Daft Lad, Steve Frith, Progressive Economics, Julius, Neil Weston, White and Sunny Out, Gregory Clifford, Roger Hill, Christopher Dobby, William Turner, Man Light, David Collins, Crimea Jewel, Patrick McGoohan, and Bruce Wilds. Woo! Did it.
Superb. Yeah, you did it. Thank you very much. Well done.
A few tricky ones.
Yeah, a few tricky ones. Some newbies. But Denise, what's the best way for people to follow up on your work? What's the go-to platform that you prefer to chat on? What do you think? What should someone do next after listening to this?
Yeah, well, you can if you want to get in contact, you can just go to my website, denisehearn.com. And I have never been that active on Twitter /X, and I'm getting ever less so. But I actually am more active on LinkedIn, and I have a good community there where we're in conversation regularly. And other than that, yeah, feel free to email me, denise@denisehearn.com.
And what's the next research topic? You're reading for pleasure right now. How are you going to put yourself through pain in the future?
Ostensibly, I'm supposed to figure out what my research center at Columbia wants to do on nature finance, which is a whole other can of worms. But I'm interested in sort of looking more at the storytelling and sort of hegemonic, paradigms, elements of economic stories over time. And so I could envision doing an next book on sort of like, what are the big stories we tell ourselves about the economy and about ourselves as humans, and how can we also envision new stories going forward? Something along those lines.
Which we desperately need. We're still living in fantasy land with the dominant stories in economics. And that's what I'm finding. I'm working on the fantasies right now. Elon Musk on one hand and Rachel Reeves on the other. Fantasies about government running out of money. And you think, oh my God, how do we get rid of this stupid story that's been around for 150 bloody years, and it's been wrong for the entire duration? Quite a challenge.
And Denise, you might find Harari's an interesting idea because in Nexus he talks about this idea that the story we've got to get to the point where we need to actually become intentional, which I've heard you talk about before, where it's okay that we make these stories up. They need to be true, but they also need to be, we need to agree to them. And he used the example of the US Constitution versus the Bible. One you're not allowed to change at all, and the other one is you can amend. There are amendments to the Constitution, so it's fallible. But the point being that, you know, this idea that we can create stories is okay, even economic ones. If there's a democratic element to it, we could even build it, and then we can change it if we need to, sort of thing. And that's what's going on in economics. Definitely at the moment, we've got this old story is just resistant to change. It won't work. And even though we can model it and show that it doesn't work, we're still not allowed to change it. It's ridiculous. It's that's become quite a religious sort of thing. So if that's
I'm really sort of obsessed with, and I know Mazzucato's written about this too, but our stories that we've consented to about what we value and how to value. And I think the nature finance piece is very interesting, because now you have a whole new set of questions where people are saying, okay, well, for, you know, as long as we've sort of been alive, a tree has been worth more dead than it is alive. And is there a way that you could invert that story and actually create economic value through a living tree? And then there's, what are the mechanisms to do that? So I'm really interested in kind of those notions of how and why we ascribe value in the economy in certain ways.
I look forward to that.
We'll see. It's a big one.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Next year.
Oh, I mean, we do need to be asking those questions, though, because we've just taken it for granted that we're all part of a market system, and our objective in life is to, you know, maximize profits or maximize wages. It's the unidimensionality of a particularly a capitalist economy, not solely, but also the fact we measure everything by money, and that you can just. I mean, one thing I felt when I was in the States. On my last, I've made 2 trips so far this year. I expected to make none. I've now made 2. In both cases, you can just feel that not quite everybody, but pretty damn close to everybody in the States is on the make. Okay, they've got to get $1 out of you. You know, your hand gets shaken, and you feel fingers going to your pocket at the same time. Not to say there aren't, you know, decent people in America, obviously. Hello, Mike. You know, good, generous souls. But the overall flavour of the place is so dominated by making a buck, and particularly New York City. I mean, that's just, you know, you can't walk down a street without you've got to fight about the beggars and the hawkers. It's just ridiculous.
You in Times Square?
Oh, bloody hell! You know, pretty much any street in New York, but Times Street is like Times Square is like the actual maximum of that. So the unidimensionality.
But how much of that is because you're living in a macro structure which doesn't provide adequate supports,
it doesn't.
Right?
When I come back to Europe, and the classic statement that Galbraith made about American capitalism, it's private affluence and public squalor.
Yeah.
And then because it is public squalor, you simply can't relax in a public space. You've got to accumulate as much money as you can to have your own private space. Come across to Europe, and even there's all sorts of problems with Europe. In general, the public spaces are quite nice. So if you're forced to spend your time in a public space, that's okay. You don't feel like you've got to find a cash way to get out of it. The trains are so much better. The streets are better. The local art is attractive to walk through. The streets in New York, God Almighty, they're going to be ugly as sin.
The Americans have infrastructure envy.
Yeah, well, that's one thing you definitely got very small infrastructures. No doubt about that. Big dicks and small infrastructures. That summarizes America.
Dave, end the show now. Steve's going off.
Denise Hearn, it has been an absolute pleasure having you back again.
Thank you for having me.
Go and buy her book,
Next
The
book
Big
can't be
Fix.
on monopolies. We agree with you.
No, I'm done. This is actually the last time I'll ever speak of them. No, just kidding.
That sounds good. Okay.
Until
Thank
the
you for
next time.
having me.
You're most welcome. For now, everybody else, take care. But we have got Alex Howland on next week talking about a calibrated UBI with us. Otherwise, remember, brush your teeth, visit your mum, and hit that subscribe and the bell so you know when we're doing that. For now, it's goodbye from Steve Keen and friends. See you soon.
Bye all.
Bye.
No outro. We don't have an outro.
We're still here. This is like
started.
behind the scenes. Let's just keep going.
Yeah, let's just keep,
This is
Bye,
the
everybody.
version now.
let's
For some reason, we have no outro.
Let's just keep going.
stuck
Talk
here
for
forever.
another minute. We can talk for another minute.
I'm sorry,
I'll
Denise.
find an outro for us.
I'm sorry, Denise. You're going to have to keep talking about monopolies. It's just there's no escape.
No, please
This
don't
is how
make
it
me.
feels. This is how monopolies feel when they just take
I'm
over.
glad you said that, though, because you're not, you're anything but one-dimensional. So thanks for
Thank
taking
you.
yourself out of that frame. Much
Oh,
appreciated.
yeah. Thank you. No, thank you for the encouragement.
Okay, well, look, I'm going to go. I'm going to have some dinner here with this. So goodbye,
No,
everybody.
you can't leave. You can't leave to the outro plays, right?
So when's the outro going to play? Are we waiting
I'm
for Godot
loading
here? Or?
Loading it right now. We've
Okay,
I screwed up. Okay, so guys, I screwed up. I didn't load it.
Last time Denise was on, she was like, "There was a really slick production." Now this time it's just going to be different. It's conversation afterwards, isn't it,
It's
Denise?
because I've turned to alcohol in boxing matches, and it's really
true.
taking me
Yeah,
off my game.
Right, Tyson versus Paul Logan. Is that what you're doing?
Oh
last
yeah.
night?
I think that fight was fixed. I think it was.
Oh, you think? Oh,
yeah, I'm pretty sure. I'm pretty sure Paul Logan should have got him.
I forgot to tell you my favorite analogy that we use in the book, which is from professional wrestling.
Oh yeah.
Should I tell you that really quick? Kayfabe. So in professional wrestling, in like WWF, everything's scripted, everything's fake, right? And if you break that, if you kind of break the fourth wall, it's called breaking kayfabe. And we use that analogy to say that like markets, now so much there's like fake rivalries, fake feuds, but there's all this tacit collusion. So we call it kayfabe capitalism.
Kayfabe.
Yeah.
Kayfabe.
Okay.
All right.
I like it.
Almost there, guys. Almost there.
Okay.
There it is. Julia, there it is. If you want to roll it, I think we're now officially going to be done. Bye, guys.